Dr. Townsell, in the last segment, you mentioned your PhD dissertation and the curveball that was thrown at you, which made me think of a project that you're working on right now. It's an upcoming book, and it's titled "Bounds of Blackness: African American Sudan and the Politics of Solidarity." Tell us about this project, please.
Yes. So I am so excited about this book. And you are actually the first person on a podcast that I'm able to talk about it with. So,
I'm honored.
yeah. So, what was really fascinating during my research for the first book were the ways in which African Americans would show up in the archive, right?
Hmm.
Where you have people talking about lynching going on in the South. You've got invocations of Black Power and Dr. King. Um, Malcolm X famously makes a trip to Khartoum in the early 1960s, right? Um, Al Sharpton travels to the
Yeah.
Sudan in the early 2000s. And so, as an African American myself, I was really kind of intrigued and wondered, well, I can't be the only African American in the history of African Americans to be interested in the Sudan, right? Like, whose shoulders am I standing on top of? Who are
Yeah.
my kind of, you know, Sudan minded African American antecedents? And so
Yeah.
that was really the kind of germinating seed that really developed into this book where going back to intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, just seeing kind of the cultural status that Sudan has long had in the African American imagination, but really going to the present day. We talked about, right, Kush and Nubia, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
These were ancient civilizations that Black people in this country really look to as examples of, look, we come from kings and queens, right? We have royal blood, right? We are not
That
just
is
enslaved
awesome.
people, sharecroppers, right? So that's really what the book is about, right? It's kind of a transnational political and cultural history of African American engagements with the Sudan, going from, the late 1800s, right, where you had Black newspapers reporting on the Mahdi, right, and some even
Wow.
praising the Mahdi, right, as this kind of anti-colonial figure who was
Yeah.
really sticking it to the Union Jack,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But going all the way to the present day, right, where the first U.S. ambassador to South Sudan is an African American woman from the Chicago suburbs, right? And so it's just
Interesting.
this awesome history. I'm so excited to share it with the world, and it should be out definitely by this time next year, but the spring of 2024.
Well, I'm very happy that you gave us a preview of it. I was going to ask a question, which I think you answered. Um, the African Americans that you identified, Malcolm X. Did you say Dr. King also went there?
Yes.
Doc, yeah.
Mhm.
MLK, Al Sharpton. Uh, they're all Christian, yet Sudan, at the time that any of these individuals went there, was decidedly very much an Islamic country. So
Sure.
I was going to ask, what is the attraction? Why Sudan? Why not many other
Sure.
countries in Africa that are, in fact, Christian? And I think you answered it. It's because of its heritage to the Kush kingdoms and Nubian kingdoms, this foundation that we come from well-established kingdoms and empires or whatever it was, and monarchy. That's really fascinating. Did I get that right?
And the reason why it's the politics of solidarity, right, is because in some ways, what my book shows is that there's a kind of selective picking and choosing, right? So Sudan is Black when it represents Kush and Nubia,
Yeah.
royalty. But then how do we deal with, like, Darfur, right? When you have the Sudanese government sponsoring the slaughter of millions of people in Darfur, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
What do we do with someone like Omar al-Bashir, right?
yeah.
Who, is indicted by the ICC. And so what my book shows, right, is that there is a way in which religion has both strengthened and undermined this idea of a kind of transnational Black solidarity. Because, yeah, Al Sharpton went to Sudan, but he went to South Sudan. Louis Farrakhan, however, the
Interesting.
head of the Nation
With
of
an,
Islam,
yeah,
right, goes to North Sudan,
yeah,
right? So there's a way in which African American engagements with the Sudan have shown both the potential but also the contradictions, right?
yeah, yeah.
And I think, I closed the book by saying, right, or by kind of asking this question, you know, when someone says Black Lives Matter, right, we need to interrogate which Black lives are being emphasized, right? And which Black lives are being kind of on the margins, right? So, if someone thinks about Sudan and only thinks about Kush, well, what about the people in Sudan now,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
If
That
someone's
is
like
really
lone picture
fascinating.
of, like if someone's lone picture of Egypt remains King Tut, Cleopatra, pyramids, and all that stuff, but they're not thinking about people, struggling under, Al Sisi, what are we really talking about? So, yeah.
We mentioned monarchy, Kush and the Nubian kingdoms, and I want to bring up an interesting conversation you and I had during the break. I think it would be fun for our audience to listen to it too. Um, the opera Aida by Verdi, which was written I think it was written for the opening of the Suez Canal back in the 1800s.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Um, in there's an Ethiopian princess that I forget how I've seen the opera twice, but I forget how it ends. I think she's in a pyramid, and that's where she dies, sort of buried alive. When I saw the opera first, and also the second time, you would have think I would have researched this, but this was before Google. I just
Mm-hmm.
aged
Sure, sure.
myself. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what I was thinking is that, well, this is being written by an Italian in the 1800s, and back then Italy was interested in Ethiopia to colonize it. Um, Egypt, its big southern neighbor for hundreds and hundreds of miles was Sudan, not Ethiopia. So could it have been that this princess in the opera was actually a Sudanese princess and not an Ethiopian princess?
So I haven't seen the opera,
Yeah,
but I think that it is because of the history of Sudan's relationship with Egypt, and the fact that at least, during the kind of classical period, right, Ethiopia was meant to reflect, and, the ancient Greek term for Ethiopia literally meant sunburnt person. And so
I'm sorry, say that
Ethiopia,
again. The Greek word for
sure,
Ethiopia meant what?
meant sunburnt person. So
Huh.
someone who in kind of the ancient imaginary was of darker skin because they had more exposure to the sun. So an Ethiopian could have been someone from Tunisia, Egypt,
Yeah,
Oman, right? Um, so
interesting.
yeah, and to your point about kind of Italian interest in the Horn of Africa at the time, kind of one of those random did you knows that I'm sure your audience would love to hear is that Eritrea, right, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
a country in the Horn of Africa, is actually derived from the ancient Greek term for the Red Sea. So it's one of the only countries in Africa that really has a kind of
Interesting.
Greek root. Yep.
Interesting. So going back to Verdi's opera, this is just an interesting
Sure,
point.
sure.
Um, when Verdi wrote and about an Ethiopian princess, one could just sort of it could have been a much wider general term that could have been
Yes.
Sudan, because when you look at the map, especially going back at that time, Egypt and Ethiopia were extremely far apart. Any
Oh,
military.
sure, sure.
Interesting. If you wanted our audience to remember just one point after everything we talked about
Sure.
Sudan, the Sudan, what would
Yeah.
that be?
The main point would be, I think that nuance is so important. And I think that, the reason why podcasts like this are so needed is because I think that Sudan in the Western imagination predominantly means one thing, right? We
Yeah,
see death, civil wars, famine, chaos,
yeah.
coups, right? Sudan, like all places, is much more than that, right? It has a history, it has culture, it has nuance, right? And so I would encourage people when thinking about the Sudan to not see the things going on in the country now as not real, because they absolutely are real and we need to be paying attention. But to know that these people and these lands do have culture and that they are human too, and that Sudan deserves a human face because they are human.
That's wonderful. Dr. Townsville, I should have asked you this before. Are you of Sudanese descent yourself?
That's a great question. I am not. I am an African American. My mom has done the, ancestry.com thing. So yeah, so I'm a mix of kind of West African and European heritage, but to my knowledge, I am not Sudanese.
Wonderful. And West Africa and that area, the culture is so much different than Sudan.
Oh yeah.
And this is something that's your passion and interest. That's what you got into it. Dr. Townsville, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Have a good one.